Harmonization. In Tartarian tradition, the ringing of bells produced resonances that were believed to cleanse spaces, harmonize environments, and ward off disease and negative influences. Villagers in Tartaria reportedly experienced fewer epidemics in areas where bells were rung regularly, and there were accounts of pests and harmful insects avoiding bell-tolled zones. The logic, though speculative, aligns with contemporary understandings of sound. Vibrations can influence biological systems, from cellular processes to bacterial growth patterns. Bells were carefully tuned, often in series, to create specific frequencies. Large bell fields were common, placed strategically across towns, valleys, and ridgelines. The arrangement was intended to create overlapping acoustic fields, generating an ambient resonance that proponents claim could influence both health and spiritual well-being. Scholars of folklore note that communities perceive these bells as protective, referring to them as the voice of the land or guardian tones. The significance of these bells in Tartaria cannot be overstated. They were central to civic life, marking not only hours and rituals, but also creating a sonic architecture that structured daily activity. Their loss, therefore, would have represented more than a cultural or aesthetic deprivation. It would have disrupted a system of social and environmental regulation that had evolved over centuries. Episode 4: The Silent Conspiracy. As the world entered the 20th century, a series of events unfolded that would ultimately silence the Tartarian bells. While the official narrative credited wartime metal requisitions, anomalies suggest a more deliberate intervention. Alternative historians argue that a hidden cabal, elites with knowledge of the bells' supposed powers, orchestrated their removal. The motive: control. By removing the bells, these powers could weaken communal cohesion, erase ancient knowledge, and establish dominance over both society and environment. The story is far more complex than wartime necessity alone. In retracing these steps, from the chaos of World War I to the ancient harmonies of Tartaria, a pattern emerges. Bells were not merely tools. They were instruments of civilization, combining art, science, and social cohesion. Their silencing was not accidental. The world may never know the full extent of the impact, but the echoes of what was lost persist in silence, in empty fields, and in the cultural memory of those who recall the days when the world rang with harmonics that safeguarded body, mind, and community. The Global Bell Network, mapping ancient resonances. The story of Tartaria and its bells is only the beginning. Across continents, from Europe to Asia, and even in the Americas, historical records suggest that large, harmonically tuned bells were central to social, spiritual, and environmental life. In medieval Europe, massive bell towers crowned cathedrals, aligned not only architecturally but acoustically, their placements carefully considered to maximize the reach of sound across towns and valleys. In Japan and China, temple bells resonated daily across cities, and monks documented their use in both ritual and environmental harmony. Even in the Americas, pre-Columbian civilizations employed large resonant instruments in ceremonial contexts, although the precise frequencies and technological sophistication remain the subject of ongoing research. Historians and alternative researchers propose that these bell installations were not isolated. They were part of a global acoustic network. According to accounts of old travelers, bell towers across distant regions were oriented to interact with the natural topography, creating overlapping fields of sound that reinforce social cohesion and, some argue, ecological balance. Lines of sight, elevation, and spacing all influenced how sound traveled. The overlapping harmonics of multiple towers might have created a protective ambient environment, not unlike a sonic lattice stretching across valleys, cities, and regions. Photographic evidence from Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries shows meticulous planning. Bells were stacked, tuned, and cast with incredible precision, and foundries kept detailed logs of their work. In some cases, the orientation of bell towers relative to neighboring towns or geographic landmarks appears deliberate. For example, in regions of the Alps, bell towers were placed on hilltops, forming a network that allowed the sound to cascade across valleys in predictable ways. The idea that sound was purely decorative or ceremonial becomes increasingly implausible when the architectural evidence and recorded practices are considered together. Contemporary accounts also describe the bell's effects on daily life. Farmers reported that pests would avoid areas near regularly rung bells. Villagers said that diseases seemed less severe when bell ringing was maintained. While these reports are anecdotal, they are remarkably consistent across multiple regions and centuries. Also exploring the reintroduction of bells into communities. Towns in Europe, Japan, and parts of Asia are experimenting with daily bell ringing as a means of reconnecting citizens to environmental rhythms and social cohesion. Anecdotal reports suggest that even small-scale reintroductions of resonant sounds can shift perceptions, improve moods, and reinforce communal awareness. If large networks of Tartarian-style bells were ever restored, the social and environmental impact could be significant, offering a bridge between ancient wisdom and modern science. The narrative of the bells thus comes full circle, from their prominent role in Tartaria to their systematic removal by wartime governments, and possibly by secretive elites who understood their power. The bell's history intertwines with cultural, environmental, and scientific dimensions. Their absence has left silent gaps in communities worldwide, yet contemporary research hints at the potential for rediscovery. Bells are more than relics. They are instruments of connection, health, and harmony, waiting to be understood once again. The silence that followed the removal of Tartarian bells is not merely an absence of sound, it is the loss of a dimension of human experience, an environmental technology, and a social regulator. By exploring the scientific principles behind acoustic influence, mapping historical bell networks, and studying modern interventions, researchers are beginning to uncover what may have been intentionally hidden or forgotten. The story of Tartarian bells is not just a tale of history, it is a call to reevaluate how sound shapes life itself and how ancient knowledge might guide a more harmonious future.
The engineering checklist. To construct a rinkyui at the scale proposed, a society would need rock-cut urban planning knowledge. Making multi-level chambers that do not collapse requires an understanding of loading, arch geometries, and how to shape columns and vaults to bear weight. This is not purely ad hoc, it is architectural engineering. The geomechanical papers on Cappadocia's tuff show that while the rock is workable, chambers of large span require competent planning to prevent cave-ins. That planning is engineering. Ventilation science during QE's shafts are arranged to move air into and through the city and to provide water access in times of siege. Some shafts double as wells. Arranging a citywide ventilation grid that ensures breathable air on deep levels while preventing CO2 buildup is not the work of improvisation. It requires empirical knowledge, maybe prior trial and error or codified rules of subterranean design. The energy of air movement, stack effects, and the need to keep smoke from hearths from choking inhabitants must have been considered. Independent researchers point to how the shafts are placed near key rooms, not randomly distributed, a pattern that suggests intention. Froude waste and water systems, presses for wine, olive oil installations, storage bins, drainage for animal stalls, and cisterns for collecting and storing water reflect planning for long durations. This infrastructure makes life below surface sustainable. The presence of refectories and stable drainage indicates a social plan for food processing and sanitation. That level of civic provisioning requires logistics and labor organization. Material handling and sealing mechanisms. The rolling stone doors are heavy circular slabs, often set in niches, rolled across grooves to close passageways. The manufacture and fitting of such doors, the handling of heavy rock discs, and the grooves and sockets to allow them to operate require quarrying, machining in the pre-industrial sense, and coordinated labor. Additionally, the presence of sockets for bars suggests locking systems and strategic designs for defense. For some, these are the most striking and technological features because they imply a concern for secure modular closure of entire levels. Networked planning. Derinkuwa is not alone. Cappadocia hosts dozens of similar complexes, Kaymakli, Ozkonak, Mazi, and others. Many researchers highlight the possibility that these cities were once connected and perhaps subterranean tunnels, forming a coordinated system of underground habitations that would read as a regional mode of urban life, rather than a scattered set of emergency shelters. If you accept that hypothesis, then you imagine network engineering, common standards of ventilation, drainage, and defensive design that cross conventional, tribal, or clan boundaries. Here, the mainstream rejoinders arrive. Geologists and archaeologists point to the particular material they quarried, soft tuff, that is easy to carve with simple tools, adzes, picks, stone hammers. The geomechanical literature shows that tuff's properties allow broad spans and stable chambers if shaped correctly. The mainstream argument says, yes, it looks sophisticated, but so does any folk tradition that devises rules over centuries. 1,000 years of learned technique in rock-cut architecture can produce remarkable feats. Human labor plus time equals large results. They point to anthropological parallels. Petra in Jordan, rock-cut churches in Ethiopia, and rock temples across India all demonstrate that pre-industrial peoples could build vast, durable rockworks without advanced technology as we define it. But the conspiracy investigator pushes back with two claims. First, the scale, standardization, and coherence of Derinkuwa's features. Ventilation grids, repeated rolling stone seals, identical room modules imply codified building standards and centralized oversight. Second, the social organization to support such a build at scale, moving labor, distributing food reserves, maintaining ventilation shafts, implies a political economy beyond neighborhood cooperatives. You need institutions to sustain the logistics of subterranean urban life. Now we arrive at the charged claim the documentary has been circling. If Derinkuwa is evidence of a coordinated subterranean urban culture, then how did such an urban fabric become hidden? The mudflood Tartaria thesis answers. It was buried in a catastrophic depositional event, a mudflood, and then the survivors and later elites disguised the resulting stratigraphic discontinuity by building above it, repurposing what was left below and creating new ground floors. For adherents, Derinkuwa and other underground cities are the physical memory of that reset. Let's step methodically through the assertions and the rebuttals. The mudflood claim, what the investigator argues. Rapid burial. There are places worldwide, advocates point to, Edinburgh, parts of St. Petersburg, and records in other locales where previous street levels now sit meters below modern pavements, and where windows and lower floors are half buried. In this reading, Derinkuyi is not a special case, but part of a pattern. An ancient urban order was buried in a large, possibly catastrophic event. The underground city is the preserved lower fraction of that order, kept intact by the mass of sediment above it. The rolling stone doors and sealed passages are evidence that those below intended to remain sealed, perhaps because the flood was lethal or to quarantine contagions. Advocates argue that if you sew together incidents of buried architecture globally, you get a sketch of a worldwide reset. Derinkuyi, the largest excavated underground city in Cappadocia, is then a textbook case of what a buried city looks like. 1. Advanced technology and standardized architecture. The standardization across different underground cities in the Cappadocia region suggests a common culture or technology pool. Add the rolling doors, ventilation solutions, and water grids, and you have the bones of a civilization that knew how to design for subterranean life. That knowledge, Tartaria adherents say, is not easily explained as incremental novelty. It looks engineered. Therefore, some other, earlier technological tradition is a more parsimonious explanation than gradualism for a few decades of emergency adaptation. Deliberate concealment. After an event, the elites, whether religious, political, or economic, had motive to present the post-event world as continuous with the pre-event order. Why admit a global catastrophe that might undermine authority, disrupt trade, or cause panic? The rhetorical act of building over and making the old levels into basements or vaults is a cover strategy. The sealed underground cities become modern places of memory, storerooms, ossuaries, or tourist curiosities, not living proof of a lost polity. In this tale, Derinkuyi is not merely a refuge, but a preserved basement of a once public civic order. Mainstream counterpoints. How archaeologists respond. Geology and stratigraphy. Geologists say there's no global sedimentary signature for a recent worldwide mudflood. When we examine soil cores and stratigraphic sections, we see accumulations consistent with human activity. River floods, localized alluviation, and the repeated resurfacing of streets over centuries. In Cappadocia, the tuff's properties allowed for easy excavation, and the subterranean features fit patterns of repeated local adaptation. Geomechanical analyses make the case that the rockwork is stable and labor-intensive, not the product of sudden technology transfer. Cultural continuity and documentary traces, archaeological layers, pottery, inscriptions, and art often show continuity with surface cultures. The same cultures that used Derinkuyi later appear in surface settlements. There's no clear archaeological horizon that marks a global reset in the accepted sense. In other words, mainstream surveys show cultural sequences that make sense without invoking a global catastrophe. The investigator's rejoinder. That rebuttal is popular and strong, but is it definitive? Listened to the geological explanations, read the academic caution, scrutinized the ventilation shafts and rolling stones, and peered into rooms laid out for wine, grain, and water. If Derinkuyi is an artifact of a larger subterranean civic order, then we should expect several consequences. Continuity across sites. Additional underground complexes with the same standards should exist. And they do. Kaymakli, Marzi, Özkonak, and others show related engineering choices. That is evidence of practice and perhaps of a shared cultural code. Hidden archives and inscriptions, if they ever existed, might have been removed, repurposed, or destroyed. Some artifacts have been found on site, but widespread record suppression could explain the paucity of grand inscriptions. A logic of concealment. If your city is buried, create a new facade above it and call it progress. Ensure the official narrative favors incremental urban development and civic planning rather than catastrophe. Convert old urban layers into cellars and vaults, and rebrand them as merchant infrastructure. That is the politics of memory management. What should be done? For the independent investigator, this is clear. More mapping, more subsurface surveys, targeted coring and radiocarbon dating, and open data so that independent scholars can examine stratigraphy and materials without being filtered through single institutional narratives. High-resolution 3D scanning of Derinkuyi and comparative structural analysis across other Cappadocian sites could reveal repeating modular proportions, tolerances in shaft spacing, and other signatures of standardized design. If we find the same architectural module in Derinkuyi and Keimakli with statistical significance, that would be a smoking gun for centralized planning. Finally, why call it Tartaria? The name has become shorthand among alternative historians for the lost global urban tradition that modern texts either forgot or actively suppressed. It's not a historical term recovered from epigraphy, it's a label for a hypothesis. A civilization whose technologies and institutions left durable material traces that mainstream archaeology either misreads or explains away. The investigator's work is to keep asking hard questions. Where did the engineering knowledge come from? How was it organized? And why do subterranean cities preserve patterns at such a large scale? Derinkuyi invites us to rethink what buried means. Not simply discarded, but deliberately sealed and left as a reserve of memory. If you walk the Royal Mile in Edinburgh or the streets of Cappadocia with a new attention, you will see traces, windows below the pavement, doors that open to stone, shafts that don't lead anywhere above. These are the fingerprints of a world under one we call ours. They argue that the past is not entirely past,